everyone who's joining us today. Welcome to the inaugural episode of the EquiLead Dialogues. We bring you a series of conversations that aim to spotlight incredible women who, through their journeys and leadership, are driving phenomenal work across the landscape of social impact. In addition, through these conversations, we will also document perspectives on what all does a conducive ecosystem for accelerating gender equity at workplace really mean. I'm Aishwarya, the co-lead of the EquiLead initiative that is supported by Arthan Foundation and Climate Asia, and your host for this evening. Our first guest on this episode of the EquiLead Dialogues is Priyanka Dutta, a change maker who has made significant contributions in the realm of education, organizational development, and capacity building. Priyanka is a program manager for one of Amani Institute's flagship programs, Leadership for Growth, and has also co-founded her own enterprise, Rajalka Consulting, where she is the director for organizational development and capacity building. Welcome, Priyanka. It's a pleasure to have you join us today.
Thank you so much, Aishwarya. It's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you for such a generous introduction. It's a lot of pressure now. Excited for the conversation. Thank you.
Not at all, Priyanka. Thank you so much for joining us today. The theme of our discussion today is building a pipeline of women for leadership and what organizational leaders can do to prioritize this. So I'm going to jump right into my first question for you. Given the theme of today's evening's chat is organizational development from a gender lens, what is that one myth that you would like to bust regarding what works and what doesn't when it comes to building a pipeline of women and women's leadership at workplaces?
Great. Thank you for the question. And it's difficult to say just one myth, but I'll start off with one and probably add a few more. So I think first thing that I just want to put out on the table for everybody to just mull over, reflect, is when we talk about developing a leadership pipeline for women, it is not a conversation that we're having against men or any such thing, right? It's not about saying that men aren't doing this, but it's a lot about how people need to work towards building a pipeline for women leadership. And that idea carries a lot of nuances to it. I think practically, in reality, there is just a bunch of people who had the privilege, the luck, the fortune, the skills to be in the place of leadership, and it's completely now their ownership and onus to support women to get there. So that's one thing that I just want to sort of call out and put out there. The other thing that people just tend to sort of say and believe is just the skills that women come in with and men come in with, and therefore who you want in the leadership roles and how convenient we want it to be. But we sort of sometimes fail to realize the complexities such statements or things come in with. For example, as humans and the society that we live in, we just are born with complexities, and they only become more and more as we grow. So the gender aspect obviously has its own set of cultural, social challenges. And as we grow, age becomes a challenge. The intersectionality of caste becomes a challenge. What kind of exposure people have had becomes a challenge. What is the brand I'm carrying on my shoulder? Which college I went to or I did not go to becomes a challenge. And we sort of see people through the lenses of these really limited lenses rather than a person as a whole. I don't know how many times people would actually think of what kind of person do I want on my leadership? And then sort of look out for those people. Many times in my experience, I've seen a lot of leadership hiring is very opportunistic. What are the things that person bringing with them? And when I say things, it's not really the skill, competency, and the person that person is, but opportunities. And it's not wrong. I don't say it's wrong, but that sort of separates the holistic perspective that the person may bring to the opportunities only that individual brings in. And are we having those conversations before we start building a leadership pipeline? So these are some of the initial thoughts that I think are important for people, organizations to think about as we start talking about women leadership. One more that I would want to add to this is as much as we talk about building skills of people that exist in the organization, the instant sort of resolution to needing a leadership person is hiring. How many times do we actually give a very genuine, very deliberate, very consistent effort in developing people within the organization? Whether it's people who are working on the ground and actually the people who are doing all the work in the organization, or people who may have joined in the management as managers or whatever. And how many individuals will you find in the roles of, let's say, senior managers, directors, senior directors, who've actually grown grounds up in the organizations? Very few, I'd say. And these are some things that organizations, leaders who are in the position of decision making, to keep in mind, to sort of open their minds towards as we think about building a leadership pipeline for women.
That actually brings me to my next question. So, how can organizational leaders really dismantle some of these systemic barriers, right, and unpack some of these complexities that hinder the progression of women into leadership roles? Part of them could be biases, but part of them could also be structural issues, right? So, what could organizational leaders really do, and what accountability measures then could be in place to actually track whether the initiatives are tokenistic or whether there's actual progress happening?
Right, right. So there are actually many parts to your question, Ashwarya, and sort of many layers. I'll try and sort of unpeel one at a time. So first is the systemic barriers, and which I try to highlight in the first question also, which is around just background, my gender, my age. I mean, there are things I can't change. The college I went to or the jobs I did for this role, it's just what it is, right? And how do I really see that person for who they are and what they bring is one, which I said earlier. There are systemic barriers which just come in with women as a gender, which is that the default caregivers for a household, right? Whether it's as a parent or as a child, both ways, for elderly parents or young children. Organizations possibly cannot sort of intervene with that, but how can they support individuals to be able to become better caregivers or be able to balance things? And I know organizations are doing fantastic work around having let's say, maternity plan, and it's not just mandatory leave, but a long-term support plan for even like 5 years to support the mother for that, for her to become and get back to work and continue with her career, because why should they just give it up? Organizations are setting spaces for children to accompany their parents, setting up creche, supporting in ways like insurance, and those are some systemic ways of solving some of these. And of course, there are many others. People often talk about have a policy in place, and that sounds wonderful, but I feel like organizations, one, first, even the biggest of organizations, and when I say biggest, I mean both in terms of size, in terms of budget, in terms of their existence in the realm, they still may not have conducive policies. And I'm not saying good or bad, but useful for the people in their organization. They don't. They're very something like words, ink on the paper, really. So one is revisiting, and even if they do, it becomes like, oh, we have great policies, but it's just a piece of paper at the end of the day. Having a useful policy is really 0.5 of a step, not even the first step towards this process. How useful it is, how relevant it is, how much is it used, really accounts for the goodness of it. And we, as people who work in the social sector, we are practitioners, really, right? A piece of paper and some ink on it really doesn't make a difference. But how, and around policies, I think one is just to have it, but also how often do organizations really revisit them? Right? Today, the organization's strength is more men, less women. The policies will be different. 2 years later, maybe 6 months later, there are 70% women and 30% men. The policies need to be relooked at. Whether it's the number of days people spend in office compared to the days they work from home, the timings, the workload, the leaves, so many things. And these are some organizational, structural, and systemic things that need to be revisited. While it's just a really lovely, beautiful looking document that's stored in Keka or one such tool, and these are tiny things that can really change the direction. Two, along the same lines, is how inclusive it is, how many people are really consulted or spoken with when such ideas are put together, when a policy is put together, and how many people are heard, and their sort of inputs taken. So these are things around the same line. In terms of accountability measures, again, because I said we're practitioners, I was just thinking through, and maybe it's policy tends to be an accountability measure on paper that yes, we have it in place, and sector organizations are learning to be compliant given everything that's happening around us. But how much that compliance really turns into deliberate reflective action. And I was thinking, why don't organizations use tools like the six thinking hats? And what that does is it removes the judgment and the bias and assumptions we have attached to a particular gender, and puts everything into perspective and make things very objective, right? So if people are thinking through something very difficult or thinking of a strategy, people just play roles based on the hat they're wearing. They're not wearing a woman's hat or a man's hat or a third gender's hat, right? And that just opens a very, very objective space for conversation. I remove my gender lens completely and look at that person as green hat, red hat, whatever, and they bring in that perspective. The person who's wearing the hat, it's very liberating for them too, because I feel like it's not just about how somebody else is looking at me, given who I am and my social presence, existence, but it's also about what I've told myself due to my conditioning, right? As a woman, I'm supposed to be emotional. If I'm not, then I only have problem with how I'm behaving or sort of being. And wearing that hat gives me that sort of freedom from being a woman and supposedly behaving in a certain manner. And I feel like using some of this could be so liberating and valuable and bring in something so positive and meaningful. Another very interesting thing that I came across a few weeks back, which I thought was quite mind-blowing. It's again a tool, a concept, which I'd like to share, which is called steel manning. Well, we can just ignore the manning man thing there and just look at the term. It's very interesting because uh, the reason why people think of having a certain gender at the leadership position is because of the role that thing comes in with, right? For example, a senior director needs to be a certain way. They need to present themselves to the board. They have to take decisions which are really quick and dirty. We don't have time to think through things. We can't be emotional, etc., etc., etc. And therefore the whole argument comes in, and people wear their gender capes and all, and speak from that space. We behave in a certain way by default. We're naturally so. What steel manning does is that any two people or whatever, anyone in a conversation, their role is to strengthen the other person's argument and give the best possible argument from that perspective, which even that person may not have. And so the role that people are playing is to pick one argument and strengthen that completely, and then pick up the opposing argument and strengthen that completely. And imagine the content that is there in the room at that point, right? We're not fighting our gender battles. We're not coming with biases, assumptions, judgments. You are this and I am that. But we are just looking and talking about the problem on the table or the challenge that is being discussed. And I feel like, again, this is so powerful because somebody will deliberately step into someone else's shoes and think from that lens, sort of shedding away everything else that I said earlier. And because it's just a simulation, right? It's a role play. I'm not being that person, and therefore I don't feel burdened. But for the purpose of the exercise, I do that. And I feel like organizations, if they start using tools like these, uh, I think a lot of ego, a lot of burden will just sort of get out of the way. And we'll start treating each other as humans and be a lot more holistic and vibrant and humane. Yeah, I mean, I don't have like fancy accountability measures like reports and stuff like that, but these are really practical things that we as practitioners can and do. And it really is not about like the executive leadership or junior associates. It applies to everyone. Yeah.
Very well put, Priyanka. In fact, I think that's something that we keep also trying to unpack at EquiLead. That it's equity is not an out there concept. It is really everyday behavior that we really want to nudge, and everyone needs to be equitably responsible to ensure that a workplace is safe and is transformative and is enabling, and and the conducive ecosystem that we talk about is not something which is this fancy concept. It's something that we all in the workplace with colleagues, as leaders, as team leads, as employees and colleagues have to really co-create. So a lot of what you said in fact speaks to that, and we would love to actually read more into the resources that you've suggested, and probably also put it out for the benefit of our viewers and readers out there as well. um,
Sure.
so, taking a slightly different direction in the conversation now. So, we've talked about what organizations can do to accelerate, gender equity at workplaces. Coming, say, to the perspective of a woman herself who aspires to be a leader, or who is in a position of leadership and wants to scale up further. Um, where do
Hmm.
you think mentorship, sponsorship programs can play a role? And I ask you this because I know you've come from that world of work and intervention, where you worked on individual capacity building of individuals and people from a professional domain and sphere. So, what role then could maybe mentorship or sponsorship programs play when we talk about accelerating women's leadership in the workforce?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking. Um, One thing I want to say before I get into answering your question is that irrespective of um, the age of the woman we're talking about, right? Since we're talking about women leadership or how many years they've spent working, everyone comes in with their own set of insecurities, challenges, baggages, etc., etc. And that's true for humans. So I wouldn't just put that for women, but everyone. And the work that I luckily had a opportunity to be a part of also transcended some of this, just because we were able to bring a really amazing bunch of women together. So that work was around building governance faculties in individuals who corporate women leaders who'd like to be on boards of social purpose organizations, and they're like really well accomplished individuals having spent 20 plus years in their fields across different domains and sectors. And it was amazing to see how when one is stepping into a sector that is unknown, or or spaces that are uncertain and you don't know, those insecurities come back irrespective of what we may have achieved in our lives. And it is about uh, again the structures of a particular sector, the jargons that are spoken, the language that we don't know about, one feeling like an outsider, etc. And this was one structural concept, but I'm sure even within our own sectors, our own organizations, our own communities, the same things happen. So it is not something unusual. We just got to sort of try and test it in a certain space. And it was absolutely wonderful to see how, with a certain structure in place, one, we were able to win people's trust to do something like this. And I think more so the peer group that got formed, so cohort after cohort after cohort, but also cohorts with each other, across cohorts, and the camaraderie and the friendships and the sisterhood that got created. So one was this whole idea of combination of training and mentorship and supporting people in a very laboratory sort of a space, very safe space, so to say, but also flexibility and a playground for people to engage with each other. And I felt like that was so powerful. And I also wish it could be done, something like that could be done for women who are much younger or starting off, because that's where, when people are like 8-10 years of experience, it's a beautiful space to be in because you've learned things and you're now applying, but also a space where if you don't get the right set of mentors, it sort of can interfere with people's own confidence to do what they want to do and trust in themselves. And so I'd agree that yes, sponsorship programs or mentorship plays a very, very important role. And I think what comes in with it is, one, not everybody may have a privilege of having an external mentor or being a part of a sponsorship program or even having the access and exposure to things like that. I come in with a space where I'm fairly privileged to have been able to be a part of many such things, but not everybody is. Um, what can be done within organizations itself for their managers to be their mentors, or another dotted line manager to be a mentor, or an organization leader to be a mentor and guide them? How can we create peer mentors, or interesting stuff like that, so that people can really nurture themselves and grow in the spaces that they are in? Yeah.
I think that'll also be more sustainable because, like you said, and this is something that we've also found in the course of building our work, that leadership is not a limiting concept. Leaders are getting younger. I think definitions of leadership are changing. There are women leaders, and then there is the whole concept of leadership and women in them, which are completely two different concepts as well, right? And then we talk about making organizational, transformative workplaces within organizations, and what does that look like? And what you spoke really alludes to that how do we make it systemic so that it becomes sustainable and it becomes an organizational priority rather than just a good to have. um,
Correct.
right? And so yeah, a lot of interesting points there. Thank you so much, Priyanka. My last question to you before we probably move towards audience questions, if we have any, is so coming to your personal journey, what is that one factor, given all that we've spoken about, do you feel has been extremely critical to your professional growth and the decisions or the choices that you've made? If you could just briefly tell us about that.
Yes, that could take me a really long time, but I will keep it crisp. I think critical factors have been just, I was really lucky right from the beginning, when I was a college student, to at least know what I didn't want to do, even if I didn't know what I wanted to do. And that helps. So I didn't want to be an engineer. I didn't want to be a doctor. I didn't want to be a chartered accountant. So that was all out of the way. I come from a literature background, so being in academia or mass media, etc., were options, but I possibly didn't dwell on it much. Um, I was lucky to have people around me, including my elder brother at that time, who had already started his journey in the social sector. So that was a great starting point for me. I wouldn't say I knew all what I wanted to do, etc. It took me a couple of years, but it was a nice first stepping stone. I and for people like my parents, grandparents, etc., I've had all. They do not come from a similar background in terms of work, etc. But at least the values of what I want to do was always service and doing something for people, with people, and something that we always thrived on, right? And that's the kind of professions my grandfather and my dad were in. And I feel like in some ways those values were sort of our DNA and took the form of this work that we do. So that is sort of something that I came in with. But having done like a couple of first years in Teach for India specifically, the experiences I had really educational. Um, People who join the fellowship often think of, oh, I'll be able to touch somebody's life and that'll be my contribution. But if I don't know if I did any of it, but my life definitely was touched deeply and very, very impactfully. And that sort of made me decide that I want to be in the sector. And ever since then, it was just like a thing you want to hold on to. And I've not been part of many organizations, very few, but have had the privilege of being part of really wonderful organizations, really amazing people. immense learning, lots of challenges, tons of failures. But I think a lovely combination to sort of have a great view of what I want to do today and in the future. I don't know if that answers the question, but a broad view.
It does. It does. And there are just two follow up questions that I want to place, also some that we've received from the audience. One is that, given what the journey that you've had, how would you define leadership? Like, what does leadership mean for you? And linked to that is that you've had a diverse journey even in the professional choices that you've made. So you are a part of an institution which is slightly more a formal structure. There is a set, defined set of roles and responsibilities, and then you've gravitated towards starting your own enterprise and become an entrepreneur. These are two very different career choices, and each would have obviously entailed a lot of thought, would have entailed their own peculiar set of challenges or barriers. If you could probably shed light on how has that journey been? Like, what prompted you to make those choices? How did you prepare yourself to don both these hats, and your definition of what leadership means for you? And then we close.
Great. I'll probably start off with the first question first. Um, so very interesting question, Ashwarya, and I will go back and think about it and write about it. But I think I've had very like good people around me as leaders, and I use some of what I've seen them do as definition of leadership. At the same time, I also see some of the things that I've seen people do is sort of things that are sort of a strict no for leaders. So I would say both. And I would say I've had the luxury, or I've had the luck to experience and witness both. Uh, in the typical sense of the word, leadership really is a role, or a position that people acquire on the hierarchy in any organization, in any setup, which obviously comes because we tend to define everything in structures. But I think that's just a tag or a role people carry. Real leadership is a lot more, uh, and beyond what we think it is. I think anybody and everyone is a leader, especially people who are working for people, for impacting lives, right? As many people say that we're not in the business of making toys. We're working with people, and that's a very complex thing to do. It's something huge that we've taken upon ourselves, and just by the decision of doing something like that is a proof that we have the leadership thing in us, right? Whatever, if that's an animal or an instinct, whatever you may call it, it's there. Now it's for our environment, our circumstances, etc., to bring it out. For any individual, I think leadership is visible through actions. Uh, I mean, words are great, but until it comes out in actions, it's really not. And I think specific things that I think a sign of great leadership is just how much people take accountability of their work, ownership, how well are people able to sort of let go of their egos and collaborate, how much are people able to support and help each other and help people grow. I have seen leaders not supporting their reportee managers out of ego, etc., and that is not helpful. That says a lot about that individual and their leadership, and not so much about the other person. And these are some things I feel like are so important aspects of leadership. I think another aspect, especially relevant in our sector, is that because we're doing complex work, we tend to be really hard on ourselves and then in turn rub it off on other people. Leadership is also about how open we are to differing opinions, objections, disagreements, uh, etc., and giving people the space to voice and to speak up, and understanding how different people learn and supporting them in that way is also sign of leadership. And there are enough and more lessons around adaptive leadership and servant leadership and so much more that we could keep talking about. But these are things, some really simple, practical, visible things every day within organizations that in my mind are leadership aspects and are not. Coming to the second bit, which is so difficult to respond. It has been a very, very interesting journey last couple of months, I'd say, ever since my transition out of ISDM. I spent a wonderful 7 years, almost 7 years over there. So it's been absolutely brilliant. And now I'm of course, co-leading Rajalka and doing work with Amani. It's an interesting balance. It's been about a couple of months that I'm doing this, and it's been wonderful actually for two reasons. One, I've sort of figured out what kind of work I'm focusing on at Rajalka right now and have set structures, rituals, and routines around that. And the team that I work with at Amani is very, very, very supportive. And they know my availability, my commitment to the work, etc. And there's immense support from them to be able to sort of juggle the two things. And I think that's very important. One thing that I do from myself to make sure neither of the two organizations sort of get affected is just the commitment, which means that if I've committed to something and if I don't have hours in the day to do it, I will sit through the night and do it, but I will. And that becomes important. And I feel like as an entrepreneur, I cannot say, oh, I have too much work and I can't take it up. I have to figure a way to balance it and build it into what I'm already doing. And that's really the excitement about being an entrepreneur, right? Today, there's a lot of work. Few days later, there wouldn't be. So how do I sort of make it stable and keep learning? I think another reason why I'm doing this is just the work that we're doing at Amani is so thrilling, and it aligns completely with what I'm out to do in terms of the capacity building work, working with organizations on the ground in a place like Gujarat. And that's really the reason why I signed up for it. And it just came with the benefit of wonderful team.
That's lovely to hear, Priyanka. And I think the last few minutes have been so enriching because you've touched upon so many different concepts. You've touched upon community and solidarity that a community brings in, peer mentorship, which is very critical. You've touched upon the role of what managers can be for their teams, especially be it as a mentor or as a very effective, stronger leader that they can look up to. The importance of role models and walking the talk when it comes to actually demonstrating leadership and nurturing that in their teams or in the organizational culture as well. And finally, just the commitment that it takes to actually undertake a spectrum of such work, which also the whole landscape of work that you've been engaged in, I think, will give a lot of food for thought for many, many professionals in the sector who want to probably tread on the same path. So, has been absolutely fabulous speaking with you. Thank you so much for spending the last hour with us, and look forward to continuing this conversation for sure. Thank you so much, and all the best for
Thank
everything that you
you.
do.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was great pleasure just speaking with you. I think the last hour was also a great space to just sit and reflect on some of the things. One doesn't get that space too often. But thank you for creating this space. And I wish you all great luck with everything that you aspire to do at EquiLead.
Thank you so much, Priyanka, and thanks to everyone who's joined us today this evening.